I want to correct the record for anyone who was at the plenary yesterday evening. There was a question about the legality of the war in Afghanistan, and Ann Wright said incorrectly, and I discussed this with her this morning, and she agreed with me, that the United Nations had authorized and thereby legalized that attack, which it did no such thing. The United Nations authorized the occupation 2 months into it, which is the tradition of how the West was won, how the Roman Empire spread, how the British Empire spread. You attack, you conquer, and then you make a treaty, and then you legalize things. But that is far, far different from this conception of having the United Nations authorize an aggressive war beforehand and thereby legalize it, which did not happen. World War II became the good war when we had what the Vietnamese called the American War. Afghanistan became the good war when we had the Iraq War. And so we think whatever happened in Iraq, the opposite happened in Afghanistan, is just not the case. I want to disagree also with what the professor said yesterday evening about the idea that there are not laws against war, and because we don't have legislation of sovereignty of airspace up to a particular altitude, the law leaves you free to wage war as you see fit. It's just not the case. When 9/11 happened, there was an understanding among sensible people until the propaganda took hold that a crime had been committed, that an act of terrorism had been committed. And this is all the UN ever accepted, was that an act of terrorism had been committed. And as Francis Boyle, among others, immediately pointed out at the time, there was the Montreal Sabotage Convention, there was a dozen treaties in place, there was the International Court of Justice for putting bin Laden and others on trial. There were legal means for handling such a situation, and in fact acts of terrorism had been prosecuted as crimes in the past. There was nothing new about the idea. And in fact the government of Afghanistan was willing to have bin Laden put on trial. George W. Bush wanted an authorization of that war from the United Nations Security Council and did not get it. And so the claim was put forth that it would be an act of self-defense, and thereby legalized under the UN Charter, and thereby you could sort of say the UN authorized it. But in fact, attacking an impoverished nation halfway around the globe, believe it or not, is not self-defense. And there was no threat of war or act of war by Afghanistan to begin to legitimize that. Bush also could not get a declaration of war from Congress, which he originally wanted. We haven't had one since 1941. And so he got an authorization under the War Powers Resolution, and he got one that was so perverse and novel that many argued it was unconstitutional, just as many would argue that the War Powers Resolution itself is unconstitutional, be that as it may. But this was a particularly unconstitutional transfer of almost unlimited war-making powers from the Congress to the President. Now we have a resolution in the Senate that would transfer those powers to the government of Israel, which is another step, but to transfer war-making powers to the President, not for a particular act, but in general for time to come, was a bizarre move for Congress to make. It was also, interestingly, this authorization to use military force, a document that identified the enemy. So this is a resolution that said you're going to have the war, we're going to call it a war, but the enemy are not warriors, and therefore not the Geneva Conventions and so forth don't apply, which the U.S. Supreme Court threw out 7 years later. Beyond these problems, there are forgotten laws that we just choose not to pay much attention to. So under the Hague Convention of 1899, which Afghanistan and the United States are party to, you have to go and settle these disputes by pacific means, with mediation rather than war. Under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, war propaganda is illegal. And we choose to say that the First Amendment overrides that, but that's a choice, and one that makes a certain logical sense on the assumption that each of us own a television network, which many of us don't. And so war propaganda has a certain power that in a theoretical notion of free speech and free marketplace of ideas, could be overridden, but in reality is deadly. Then you have arguments such as former federal prosecutor Elizabeth De La Vega's case that this propaganda for Iraq was a commission of fraud. So there are all sorts of other ways in which getting these wars going are illegal. One of the forgotten wars that I've written a book about called When the World Outlawed War is called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. I assume historians against the war have heard of that. Raise your hand if you know the Kellogg-Briand Pact and what it is and what it does. And nobody.
Except those of us who read your emails.
Yes. Well, get this book in the other room. After World War I, World War I was the last war that was legal. I mean, there were no laws against making war up through World War I. There were laws against atrocities, and this is how many people still think to this day. Particular atrocities are illegal, even though they are part and parcel of the war and predictably come with the war. They are illegal, but the war itself is not. In those years, in the 20s and the 30s, in this country, between the two big world wars, war was extremely unpopular. I mean, it was seen as something backwards, something foreign, something European that our nation got dragged into. We should never let it happen again. You eventually had an alliance between, and this is what my book is essentially about, is the peace movement and how it developed. But you had an alliance between the more isolationist section of the peace movement and the more internationalist section that finally, after endless failures for a decade after World War I, came up with an idea that everybody liked, and that was to outlaw war, to make war illegal. And a movement developed called the outlawry movement that was, completely mainstream. All the churches, all the new women's groups with women now having the right to vote, the veterans groups, the business groups. I mean, across the board, this is a movement led by university professors and Republican senators and lawyers, and the idea became to make war illegal, and then to set up standards of international law and courts to prosecute the crime of war and courts to resolve disputes and to set war behind us. And it very, very intentionally was a move not to make war better, not to have humanitarian wars or philanthropic wars or wars without torture, but to not have wars. And not to have defensive wars, not to have humanitarian wars, just to do away with it. And so the thinking was that we are on a path of progress away from violence. We've done away with blood feuds and slavery and dueling, and we didn't keep defensive dueling and ban aggressive dueling. We said this is a barbaric way to settle disputes. We're going to do that to war. And so you had an incredible grassroots popular movement, an international movement involving popular illegal diplomacy and U.S. peace activists ghostwriting for Mr. Briand, who was the French foreign minister, and replying for the U.S. government in U.S. newspapers, and building a world movement that on August 27th, 1928 in Paris, France, brought together the nations of the world, several of which recognized the existence of the Soviet Union, and France, once again, Germany in the process. And this is, if you've ever heard this song from the 1950s, last night I had the strangest dream I ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room and the room was filled with men. This is what happened. This was the biggest news story of 1928. This is not like secret CIA history that's been uncovered. This has been buried, intentionally buried and forgotten. And so when John Yoo wants to legalize torture, he cites Nixon's veto of the, you give me like a 5-minute warning or something when I, he cites Nixon's veto of the War Powers Resolution, even though it was overridden. He cites speeches, all of these things that are not laws. When they want to legalize campaign bribery, I mean, they cite marginalia in Supreme Court proceeding records. I mean, all this stuff that's not laws. On our side, we have laws that we choose not to hold up. And we have a law that's on the books, that's on the State Department's website, that has over 80 nations agreed to it, that other nations can agree to simply by stating so, and should, that bans war, all war. Not the bad wars, not the wars the UN doesn't like, not the non-defensive wars, war. So we can get into which atrocities are illegal, what additional ways in which particularly offensive bits of wars are illegal, but we need to get out of the idea that the wars themselves are legal. And so we ought to be making use of that piece of paper, holding that up. The idea that the Kellogg-Briand Pact is not law, isn't relevant, doesn't apply, it takes a number of forms. One is it didn't enforce. There's no mechanism for enforcement created. Well, that's not an argument not to abide by a law or not to begin enforcing it. Another is the idea that it's simply old. Well, so is the Constitution. Another is the idea that it's been replaced by newer laws, including the UN Charter, which means coming to understand the UN Charter as an act of legalizing war, the opposite of what most people understand it to be. And the other more popular, really historically the reason that people thought the Kellogg-Briand Pact didn't work was because World War II happened, right? Well, when we put in place a law against drunk driving, and the next day somebody drives drunk and gets arrested and tried and put in jail, we don't immediately declare, well, that law didn't work. Let him out. Let's have drunk driving now. The first major war after the Kellogg-Briand Pact stopped and halted and scaled back other wars, the first major war, and the last, as far as we know, major war between the big, heavily armed nations, resulted after the fact, when President Roosevelt pulled out the Kellogg-Briand Pact and said, let's use this, in the first ever trials of anyone for committing the new crime of waging war. And those trials were pretty darn effective in that we haven't had anything like World War II since. But we still have wars on the poor nations that were left out, that weren't considered, or were considered as colonies and properties. And so I think there's something to be gained from reviving awareness of this outlawry movement and taking the next step. They expected it to take generations. They expected it to take steps. They didn't think they would declare war illegal and war would vanish the next day. It was a process of stigmatizing war, of making it less acceptable and then doing away with it. I had a lot I wanted to say about additional ways in which our new drone kill programs and so forth are illegal, but maybe our next speaker will take that up.
Get to that.